ABC 7 News presents Surviving Suicide.
Hello and welcome to our ABC 7 News special, Surviving Suicide. I'm Kevin Roy, and I am a survivor of suicide. I lost my mother, Diane Marcus Roy, to suicide 13 years ago. That loss has been the driving force behind a special series of reports that ABC 7 has produced over the past year in conjunction with the Carter Center in Atlanta. Former First Lady Rosalynn Carter has been a longtime champion of mental health issues. From teenage suicide to campus killers committing suicide, in this special report, we'll be examining many issues surrounding this mental health epidemic. Suicide claims more than 32,000 lives every year in the U.S., taking nearly twice as many lives as homicide. It is the fourth leading cause of death for adults between the ages of 18 and 65. National statistics show every day about 80 Americans take their own life and 1,500 more attempt to do so. But because of the stigma still surrounding suicide, it's something we rarely talk about. We begin now with our first effort to try to change that. A very personal story, what happened to my mother and my family after she took her life. It's a story I first shared a few years ago.
Pictures of the way my family used to be. These are my most treasured possessions. My mother's smile lights up every portrait. My father says she was the glue that held us together.
She was the center of our lives. That's the type of person she was.
But behind that bright smile, Diane Marcus Roy hid a lifelong battle with bipolar disorder, manic depression, which proved to be fatal. Growing up in River Forest, there were few clues when my family lived here. At her 50th birthday party, no one could have imagined my mother would be dead a year and a half later. Her life started to unravel in 1993. After 29 years of marriage, she announced she wanted a divorce. She left my father, sold the house, quit her law practice, and moved from Chicago to Sedona, Arizona, all within a year. She also had a newfound interest in anything that was of a spiritual nature.
She was seeing spiritualists, card readers, psychics.
So many changes in so little time. Classic signs I would later learn of a manic phase. And so it was for the next 6 months, her family wanting to believe these changes were all for the better. But then, suddenly, she crashed. On a summer night in 1995, I came home to a message on my answering machine, my father telling me my mother was threatening suicide.
So what do you mean? You don't know if you can go on. Are you thinking about killing yourself?
We flew her back to Chicago. She met with a suicide counselor and came up with a plan to leave Arizona and move back home. My mother even promised my sister and me that suicide was not an option. So in late August of '95, she flew back to Sedona, supposedly to sell her condo. 4 days later, we got a call from the Sedona police. She was dead.
She put herself in a bathtub. She lit candles. She had gone to the store and bought vodka. She never drank. And she ingested this vodka as fast as she could. I think that I should have gotten on that airplane with her. I think I should have been smart enough to say no to going on the airplane. But I was none of that.
My mother did leave us a note written nearly a month before she died. She signed it, "Forgive me if you can. Love, Diane."
I feel like she damaged me. She hurt me in such a horrible, horrible way.
Forgiveness has been difficult, especially forgiving ourselves for missing or overlooking some of the warning signs. Experts say a person might be suicidal if he or she talks about committing suicide, experiences drastic changes in behavior, withdraws from friends, loses interest in work, school, hobbies, or gives away prized possessions. My mom gave away her dog weeks before she took her life. Now, it all seems so obvious. She was mentally ill. Poor decisions and radical life changes sank her into a terrible depression. But tragically, my mother never was diagnosed as manic depressive. She did take antidepressants on occasion, but she was never hospitalized nor got the kind of help she really needed because she was an expert at concealing her true feelings.
The psychologist who saw her at the Suicide Prevention Center said to me, and I saw her later, that she was the best they had ever seen at hiding what she felt.
The thinking is so fevered that one does false credit to think that your mom was logical and thoughtful at the time she killed herself. It was her illness speaking and not her.
Her illness may have had the final word, but as my photo albums show, she spoke to us with love and caring during her 51 years. It is those words I now hear. It is those words that I still miss.
13 years later, I still miss her every day, but my family and I are able to look at those photos now and remember the many happy and joyful memories she gave us. For survivors of suicide, mental health experts say it's important to realize that more than 90% of those who complete suicide have a psychiatric illness. In the end, it's their illness that has taken over, and appreciating that fact is critical for coping with the guilt and the grief of being a survivor. One very public family was suddenly confronted with that grief a year ago. Former Illinois Attorney General Jim Ryan and his wife Marie had endured so much already, cancer and losing a child. But then came what they say was their family's toughest loss. Their 24-year-old son, Patrick, committed suicide in October of 2007. The Ryans had always been so public about their family's struggles, but this cut to the core. Marie Ryan told me she didn't want to do anything to dishonor her son's memory, and so she was reluctant to talk publicly about it. But the more she thought it over, the more she realized that would be succumbing to the stigma. If it could help anyone, the Ryans said, then Patrick's story must be told. They sat down with me for their first interview about it, sharing how they were desperately holding on to hope.
I really thought it was talk. I would have, not in a million years would I have thought Pat would have taken his own life. That's the truth.
For Jim and Marie Ryan, October 7th started out as a glorious day. They welcomed a new granddaughter into the world. Here's Patrick holding his niece at the hospital. But just a few hours after this photo was taken, their day turned into a nightmare. A call from Elmhurst police. Patrick, their 24-year-old son, was inside their home, alone, with a gun.
So we're huddled a couple doors down, praying that he's going to come out of this all right.
But Patrick shot himself.
There is just so much guilt and despair on your own part because you feel that you have failed this child in the most basic thing that you could possibly fail them at, that they don't even want to live anymore.
Yeah, we're struggling. This is a big loss to our family.
A family that has seen more than its share of pain through the years. First, there was Jim Ryan's lymphoma. Diagnosed in 1996 when he was DuPage County State's Attorney, it returned in 2002 when he was the Republican nominee for governor. In 1997, the youngest of their 6 children, 12-year-old Anne Marie, collapsed and died of a brain tumor. And 10 months later, Marie Ryan suffered a near-fatal heart attack. While they dealt with all of these health scares very publicly, privately, they say they were in a fight to save Patrick. He was 14 when Anne Marie died, and the 2 youngest siblings were especially close.
Pat was never completely the same after Ann died.
Never.
There's no question.
Pat sank into a severe depression and dropped out of high school. When he was 17, he entered rehab.
He was medicating himself, with street drugs.
It was around this time that Pat was diagnosed as having bipolar disorder, manic depression. He also had 2 very painful back surgeries and got hooked on prescription painkillers. He was seeing psychiatrists and was on mood stabilizers, but earlier this year, the Ryans say they noticed a change.
That's what started Pat spiraling. You couldn't get through to him anymore. You could see that something had shut down, and he just didn't see life as, there was just nothing.
He has said, don't think I'll shoot myself or I'll kill myself.
But Jim Ryan says he never believed those threats would be carried out. Now, 7 weeks after losing Patrick, they are in counseling. Still in shock, still feeling guilty and angry. They also say they're holding on to hope that their honesty might be helpful to someone.
Despite our loss, we feel lucky. We have a great family.
Don't be ashamed to reach out for help. You can't deal with some demons by yourself.
We have to bring this out in the open and shine a light on it, say, be honest about it, let's deal with it, let's do something about it.
Since our interview, Jim and Marie Ryan have been speaking out at suicide prevention conferences and making it their mission now to help as many people as possible. The Ryans asked that all donations in Patrick's name be made to the LOSS program of the Catholic Charities. LOSS stands for Loving Outreach to Survivors of Suicide, a program they've been helped by over the past year. And we'll have more about LOSS coming up a little later in this program. There are a number of resources designed to help families, among them the National Suicide Hotline. You can call 1-800-SUICIDE or 1-800-273-TALK. All of this information and more is on our website, abc7chicago.com. Stay with us. We'll be back with more in a moment. Welcome back. Earlier I mentioned the Carter Center in Atlanta, and the report you just saw about Patrick Ryan was the first in a series of stories we produced over the past year as part of a fellowship I've had with the Carter Center. Next, we examined teenagers and suicide. It is the third leading cause of death for young people between the ages of 15 and 24. And in recent years, the suicide rate for teenagers has spiked alarmingly. Some public health experts now believe that a black box warning that the Food and Drug Administration placed on antidepressants in 2004 may have backfired. Rather than saving lives, they believe the warning has resulted in a sharp decline in the number of teenagers being put on antidepressants. And that may be what is behind the biggest spike in suicide rates in 15 years.
I always ask myself, why did this happen?
It's a question that will forever haunt Kathleen McManus. She will always wonder if taking her daughter Megan off antidepressants was a deadly decision.
I truly, really regret it, and I wish that she was still on it.
To the outside world, Megan was beautiful and popular, but inside, she was battling clinical depression. It first surfaced at the age of 13. Megan was put on the antidepressant Zoloft, but in 2004, the Food and Drug Administration put a black box warning, its highest warning level, on antidepressants for pediatric use. Because of that warning, Megan was taken off Zoloft.
They thought that there was too much risk involved, that she would commit suicide or had suicidal thoughts.
But that is exactly what happened. It started when Megan's close friend, Maribel, took her life, inspiring Megan to create this website called Students Overcoming Suicide. It became Megan's mission to save lives. But last year, her depression returned. After a suicide attempt, she was placed back on antidepressants, but her mother says there wasn't enough time for them to work. Last July, just after graduating from Palatine High School, Megan ended it all by hanging herself.
The pain that Megan felt was so unbelievable that she didn't see any way out.
Megan and Maribel are part of an alarming trend. The Centers for Disease Control says the suicide rate spiked for teens between 2003 and 2004. A 9% increase in 15 to 19-year-old boys, a 32% increase in 15 to 19-year-old girls, and in 10 to 14-year-old girls, a 75.9% increase.
I think it should be extremely alarming.
Dr. Robert Gibbons, a researcher at the University of Illinois, Chicago, says parents and doctors have been scared off by the warning, and prescriptions for antidepressants for teens dropped 22% the year after the warning was issued and have continued to drop ever since.
I am concerned that the unintended consequence of the black box warning was to decrease the availability of treatment to seriously depressed children and has consequently increased the rate at which children take their lives.
Enter Ken Myers.
This is someone who you believe is about to kill herself.
He formed Alyssa's Mission 3 years ago after his niece, Alyssa Myers, a sophomore at New Trier High School, took her life.
How did she commit suicide?
She committed suicide by hanging herself.
Myers has brought his message of suicide prevention to 10,000 students so far in the Chicago area. Many school districts have shied away from the topic, but Myers is proud his group is helping to change that stigma and helping to save young lives.
You're arming kids with information so that they can make wise decisions not to do it, because we're having an impact. We're saving lives. It's a warning.
Alyssa's mission partners up with school districts to return on a yearly basis and also includes parents in the process. Since our report first aired, Alyssa's mission has been invited into many more suburban school districts, getting its important message out to more young people. And just recently, a new study came out confirming that the one-year spike in youth suicides was not a fluke. Researchers found that while rates fell about 5% in 2005 after that large increase in 2004, they were still far higher than they would have been expected based on historical trends. To learn more about Alyssa's mission, as well as many other resources about suicide and where to turn to for help, we have all of that information on our website, abc7chicago.com. We'll be right back. Welcome back. And now we turn to the question of what happens when a suicidal person turns homicidal. Rarely do people who want to harm themselves want to harm others, but in recent years there has been a disturbing trend. We're talking about campus killings. Earlier this year, the horror hit at Northern Illinois University. Before that, there was Virginia Tech, Columbine, and so many others. Mental health experts say much of the response to these tragedies has been reactionary, focusing on efforts like increasing security, adding campus police, and text messaging as a way of alerting people. While all of that is certainly helpful, a growing number of mental health experts believe there is much more we could and should be doing to prevent these tragedies, beginning with how we view and reach out to the potential killers. The key to understanding them may be their suicidal tendencies. Just after 7 a.m., April 16, 2007, Sung-Wee Cho begins his shooting spree at Virginia Tech, killing 32 people before taking his own life. Valentine's Day 2008, Stephen Kazmierczak shoots and kills 5 people in Cole Hall on the NIU campus and injures 17 others before finally taking his life. At Columbine High School in Colorado, an Amish school in Pennsylvania, and several other school shootings, the gunmen all eventually committed suicide. But we focus on the mass killings.
Those are mass murders, but really what they are suicides preceded by mass murder.
Dr. Carl Bell, a psychiatrist with the University of Illinois, believes we have it backwards. To prevent more of these tragedies, he says we need to realize what they really are. He calls them suicides preceded by mass murder.
What you've got in the Virginia Tech guy and all these other folk who commit suicide after they perpetrate the mass murder are people who are depressed and suicidal, and they're trying to make a big statement.
Dr. Bell believes if we would do more to target the mentally ill on college campuses with earlier, more effective treatment of depression, it might prevent a potential mass murderer from spiraling out of control.
These are suicidal people first and homicidal secondly.
The University of Chicago's Dr. Morton Silverman agrees viewing it that way is a key to prevention. Sung-Wee Cho's behavior and writings alarm professors and police. He was put through a commitment hearing and found to be potentially dangerous, but there was no follow-up to ensure he got treatment. Stephen Kazmierczak's parents and high school knew about his mental illness, schizophrenia, and he was reportedly obsessed with the shootings at Columbine and Virginia Tech. But still, he slipped through the cracks in college, and just weeks before his rampage, Kazmierczak took himself off the antidepressant Prozac.
These particular people are not getting the assistance that maybe could have made a difference in terms of counseling, and it results in these kind of tragedies.
Nancy Zars of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology says the campus killings have been a wake-up call. Colleges are reaching out now more than ever to troubled students. And while in the past, privacy concerns may have prevented parental notification, as was the case with Sung-Hui Cho, now faculty are being encouraged more than ever to speak up about students who worry them. And that has resulted in greater demand for mental health services. We wanted to ask Northern Illinois University about its response, but our requests were turned down. In a statement, we were told, excessive media coverage of campus threats clearly contributes to their proliferation. Dr. Carl Bell believes there is a copycat element to the threats and shootings. He points out that there are already specific guidelines that the media follow because of the concern over suicide contagion. And he thinks similar guidelines might help to reduce campus killings.
When there's a suicide, the media should not report where it happened, how it happened, what weapons were used, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because people will imitate that behavior.
Scientific research has proven that suicide contagion is a very real phenomenon, and so we in the media take certain precautions before reporting on suicides, if we report on individual cases at all. But there have been no studies done to date to determine if there is a copycat element to the campus killings as well. Dr. Bell says he's working on putting together such a study to try to prove his theory. In the meantime, we think it's important to mention that in newsrooms across the country, including here, there have been heated debates about what is appropriate to include when reporting on campus killings and other mass murders. There's no doubt they are newsworthy, but at the same time, we try to strike a balance between presenting the facts and not glorifying the gunman in the process. Stay with us. We'll have more in a moment. In its wake, the act of suicide leaves behind thousands of new survivors every year, family members and friends left behind to deal with the consequences and overwhelming grief. There are an estimated 180,000 new survivors of suicide annually. Now, we return to the second half of my special segment, A Son of Suicide. We get a rare inside look at a suicide survivor support group and the special bond between survivors helping to heal perhaps the deepest wound of all.
So many smiles, so many young people, so much life. These would hardly seem to be the faces of depression, yet these are the faces of suicide.
My name is Melissa Masek, and I lost my brother Jay on June 9th, 1997. He shot himself in the head.
And these are the voices.
She struggled from postpartum depression until she finally took her life.
Of survivors of suicide.
It was such a shock. We can't believe it. He didn't show any of the depression.
Every story is different.
I thought he was okay, and I even talked to him about suicide.
But they all end the same way as my mother's. When Diane Marcus Roy took her life 5 years ago, my sister, my dad, and I gained lifelong memberships in a club with the highest of dues.
I feel totally rejected, like unworthy of living for.
Welcome to a monthly support group called LOSS, Loving Outreach to Survivors of Suicide, run by the Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Chicago. Father Charles Ruby has counseled thousands of survivors over the past 22 years.
When you go to a LOSS meeting, you're in a room with other people who know what you're going through, the pain that you're in.
You felt rejected by your mother, and I felt that my mother love wasn't enough for my kids.
What could be worse than losing a child to suicide? Catherine and John Roach lost 2 of their children to suicide. Growing up, brother and sister Paul and Cassie Roach were inseparable. In 1995, Paul told his mom he wanted to talk to a counselor and had thought about taking his life. But before she could get him help, Paul convinced his parents he was fine. On April 4th, 1995, less than 2 weeks after turning 17, the football player with a wide smile committed suicide.
He had taken his life during the night. He hung himself in his closet.
Cassie took it especially hard. The girl who loved to sing was filled with grief and her own personal demons. For a year and a half, she struggled, dropping out of college, seeing a psychiatrist. She was even diagnosed with a chemical imbalance and put on an antidepressant. In the summer of '96, Cassie seemed to have stabilized. That fall, she enrolled as a sophomore at Loyola. But less than 2 weeks later, she ended her life, just like her brother. Same cause of death, hanging.
I can't say that I felt worse because I couldn't ever feel any worse than I did when I lost one child. I mean, it's the worst you can possibly feel. So it's not twice as bad because you're already at the worst place you could be. But it's twice as long.
Twice as long for a grieving process that counselors say usually takes at least 2 years before any sense of normality returns. Even then, survivors are never relieved of all the questions.
There's a lot more questions and there's a lot more to work through when it's a suicide, as opposed to if it was a car accident or if it was cancer.
Most of us have come to realize our loved ones were mentally ill. Now, after 5 years, my sister, my dad, and I still miss my mother every day. But thanks to this support, counseling, and the miracle of time, we are able to feel joy once again.
It just seems as if I can live with it more easily than I could live with it 2 years ago, or 3 definitely.
Even though I am a mom who lost 2 children to suicide, in the end, I have been more blessed than not.
Catherine and John Roach remain very active members